September 1944. The roads of France were choking with dust. General George S. Patton's Third Army was not just marching, it was sprinting. Since breaking out of the hedgerows of Normandy, the Americans had torn across the French countryside at a pace that defied modern military logic. They were capturing towns faster than the map makers could print maps. They were running on adrenaline, captured German fuel, and the sheer force of Patton's will. To the Allied commanders, the war seemed to be entering its final act. The German army in the west appeared broken, a disorganized rabble retreating toward the Rhine River. Intelligence reports described the Wehrmacht as disoriented and incapable of organized resistance. But deep inside the wolf's lair, his concrete headquarters in the forests of East Prussia, Adolf Hitler was looking at a different map, and he was planning a massacre. Hitler was obsessed with the idea of a decisive blow. He believed that the American advance was a house of cards, overextended, thin, and vulnerable. He didn't just want to stop Patton, he wanted to cut off his head. In strict secrecy, Hitler issued a directive that would strip the Eastern Front of its last reserves. He ordered the creation of new specialized units, the Panzer Brigades. On paper, these brigades were terrifying. They were a wall of steel designed to smash anything the Americans could put in the field. Foremost among them were the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades. Unlike the battered divisions retreating from Normandy, these units were factory fresh. They were equipped with the pinnacle of German engineering, the Panther medium tank, with its sloped armor that could bounce American shells like hail, and the fearsome Tiger I and Tiger II heavy tanks, monsters that carried the dreaded 88mm cannon. A single Tiger tank could destroy a Sherman from 2,000 yards away, long before the American could even scratch the German's paint. Hitler was sending 92 of these steel leviathans, supported by swarms of Panthers and Panzer IVs, to strike Patton's exposed flank near the town of Arracourt in the Lorraine region. The plan was simple and brutal. Strike the U.S. 4th Armored Division while it was low on fuel, cut the supply lines, isolate Patton's spearhead, and annihilate it. It was to be a masterclass in armored warfare. But there was a fatal flaw in Hitler's wall of steel. While the machines were brand new, the men inside them were not veterans. The seasoned tank crews, the aces who had conquered France in 1940 and fought in the vast steppes of Russia, were dead or captured. The new crews manning these new Panthers were teenagers, hastily trained in short courses. They knew how to drive the tanks, but they didn't know how to fight in them. They lacked the tactical intuition that comes only from surviving a battlefield. Furthermore, the commanders of these brigades were chosen for their fanaticism, not their tactical flexibility. They were under strict orders from Berlin to attack relentlessly, regardless of the terrain or the situation. As mid-September arrived, the weather turned. The bright summer skies of France gave way to the heavy, clinging fogs of autumn. The Hitler weather had arrived. Grounding the terrified American fighter bombers, the fog provided the perfect cover for the German assembly. Under the cloak of night and mist, the engines of nearly 100 German armored vehicles roared to life. The ground in Lorraine began to tremble. The Americans, resting in their bivouacs near Arracourt, had no idea what was coming. They thought the war was winding down. They were servicing their engines, writing letters home, and waiting for fuel trucks. They didn't know that just over the ridge, the largest concentration of German armor seen in the West since D-Day was shifting into attack formation. The wall of steel was moving, and it was heading straight for a collision that would decide the fate of the Third Army. The trap was set, the tiger was hunting, and the Americans were about to wake up to a nightmare. September 19th, 1944. 0730 hours. near the village of Arracourt, France. The world had turned white. A dense, suffocating fog, the kind the locals called brouillard, had rolled across the rolling hills of the Lorraine region during the night. It was a heavy, wet blanket that clung to the ground, swallowing farmhouses, trees, and entire armies. Visibility was reduced to less than 50 yards. For the men of the U.S. 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A, the morning began with a deceptive calm. They were the tip of Patton's spear, veteran crews who had raced across France. They were brewing coffee on camp stoves, their Sherman tanks parked in defensive loggers, engines cold. They believed the Germans were miles away, retreating in disarray toward the Rhine. They were wrong. Hidden inside the white void, less than a mile away, a mechanical leviathan was moving. The 113th Panzer Brigade was advancing in a massive column. They were not retreating, they were hunting. Their brand-new Panther tanks, with their impenetrable sloped front armor and high-velocity 75mm guns, were designed to kill American tanks from 2 kilometers away. But the fog had stolen their greatest advantage: range. The collision, when it happened, was sudden and violent. A platoon of American M4 Shermans from the 37th Tank Battalion was creeping forward on a reconnaissance patrol. The commander, Lieutenant Charles Trover, strained his eyes against the mist. The damp air muffled sounds, distorting the familiar clank and squeak of tank tracks. Suddenly, the white wall ahead of them dissolved. Emerging from the mist like a primordial beast was the angular, menacing hull of a German Panther. It was massive, and it was close, terrifyingly close. Less than 70 yards separated the two machines. "Tank! Front! Traverse right!" Trover screamed into his throat mic. The encounter defied every manual of tank warfare. This wasn't a tactical maneuver, it was a knife fight in a closet. The German crew, blinded by the fog and inexperienced in close-quarters combat, hesitated. Their long 75mm barrel was pointed slightly away. They frantically tried to hand-crank their turret to face the American threat, but the heavy German turret was slow, agonizingly slow. The American gunner didn't hesitate. The Sherman's turret, powered by a hydraulic motor, spun fast. Wham! The 75mm shell from the Sherman slammed into the side of the Panther, its weakest point. At this point-blank range, the physics of armor penetration were brutal. The German tank shuddered. Smoke began to pour from the hatches. But the shot echoed, and the echo was answered. All along the line, the fog erupted with muzzle flashes. It was a chaotic, swirling melee. American Hellcat tank destroyers and Shermans were bumping into German Panthers and Panzer IVs in the mist. There was no front line. There was no strategy. It was a brawl. "They're everywhere!" a radio operator shouted over the battalion network. "I can't see them until they're on top of us." For the Germans, the fog was a catastrophe. Their wall of steel was designed to fight as a cohesive unit, engaging from a distance where their superior optics and guns made them invincible. But here, in the blindness of Arracourt, they were isolated. They couldn't see the hand signals from their commanders. Their radios were jammed with panic. The Americans, however, were improvisers. They were used to their tanks being undergunned and underarmored. They knew that to survive, they had to move. A swarm of M18 Hellcats, lightning-fast tank destroyers with paper-thin armor but a punchy 76mm gun, raced through the fog. They used the lack of visibility to their advantage, drifting like ghosts around the flanks of the slow-moving German columns.
One Hellcat commander spotted the silhouette of a Panther through a break in the mist. He didn't stop. He gunned his engine, flanking the beast, drifting behind it, and putting a shell into its engine block before the German gunner even knew he was there. The blind clash had turned into a slaughter. The Germans had expected a shooting gallery. Instead, they had walked into a trap of their own making. The fog that was supposed to hide their advance instead blinded their giants. As the sun began to burn through the mist around 10 a.m., the horrific scale of the engagement became clear. Burning hulks of German armor littered the fields. The smell of burning diesel and cordite was overpowering. The initial shock was over, but the battle was just beginning. The 113th Panzer Brigade had been punched in the nose, but they were still lethal, and now they were angry. The fog was lifting, and the true test of David against Goliath was about to start in the clear light of day. As the sun finally burned through the morning mist on September 19, 1944, the terrifying reality of the battlefield was revealed. The fog had been the great equalizer, forcing a chaotic, point-blank brawl. But now, in the clear light of day, the laws of physics took over. And the physics were entirely on the side of the Germans. To the men of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, the sight across the valley was nightmare fuel. The German Panther tanks, with their sloping frontal armor, were virtually invulnerable to the standard American 75mm gun. A Sherman could fire a shell at a Panther's front glacis plate from 500 yards, and it would simply bounce off, screeching into the sky like a rejected spark. The German 75mm high-velocity gun, however, could slice through a Sherman like a hot knife through butter from 2 kilometers away. This was the Goliath scenario. On paper, the Americans were dead. They were outgunned, out-armored, and outnumbered. But battle is not fought on paper. It is fought by men and machines, and the Americans discovered a fatal flaw in the German giants. The German crews were green. They were teenagers rushed through training to fill the gaps in Hitler's lines. They knew how to drive, but they didn't know how to fight. In contrast, the American crews were veterans. They had survived the hedgerows of Normandy. They operated with the cohesion of a wolf pack. And they had one mechanical advantage that would change history: the hydraulic turret traverse. A Sherman tank's turret could spin 360 degrees in 15 seconds. A Panther tank, however, relied on a power takeoff from its main engine to turn its massive turret. If the German tank was stationary or moving slowly, which they often were in the muddy terrain, the turret traversed agonizingly slowly. To turn the gun quickly, the German driver had to rev the engine, giving away his position with a plume of black smoke. "Don't go toe-to-toe," came the order over the crackling American radios. "Flank them. Get on their sides." The battle turned into a deadly dance. The Americans stopped treating the engagement as a firing line and started treating it as a race. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a legendary tank commander, directed his units with surgical precision. The smaller, faster M4 Shermans and the lightning-quick M18 Hellcats revved their engines and charged, not directly at the Germans, but around them. It was a terrifying gamble. To get a kill shot, an American tank had to race across open ground, exposing itself to the lethal 88 and 75mm German guns to get behind the enemy. One Sherman platoon commander spotted a group of 3 Panthers emerging from a woodline. Instead of reversing, he ordered his driver, "Gun it! Go left, hard!" The Sherman roared forward, mud flying from its tracks. The German commander in the lead Panther saw the movement. He shouted for his gunner to track the American tank, but the American tank was moving too fast. The heavy German turret groaned, struggling to catch up with the speeding target. The German driver tried to turn the entire tank to bring the gun to bear, but the mud slowed him down. The Sherman drifted around the side of the Panther, closing the distance to 400 yards. Now the German tank's side armor, flat and thin, was exposed. Fire! Wham! The American shell didn't bounce this time. It punched through the Panther's side, igniting the ammunition stored in the sponsons. A catastrophic explosion ripped the turret off the German tank. All across the valley, the scene repeated itself. The Davids were swarming the Goliaths. Utilizing superior radios, the Americans coordinated their attacks brilliantly. One Sherman would pop up over a ridge to draw the Germans' attention. As the slow German turret began to turn toward the distraction, two other Shermans would break cover from the flank, pouring fire into the enemy's exposed sides and rear. The Germans, lacking experience and communication, panicked. Their formation broke. The terrifying Panthers, designed to dominate long-range duels, were being picked apart in a high-speed melee. The inferior American tanks were not just surviving, they were slaughtering the pride of the Wehrmacht. By early afternoon, the field was littered with burning German steel. The smoke from dozens of destroyed Panthers and Tigers rose into the autumn sky. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered, not by a bigger gun, but by speed, skill, and the cold courage of men who refused to be paralyzed by the size of their enemy. The Sherman had taken its revenge.
The sun, which had been the Germans' greatest ally by hiding them in the mist, now became their executioner. By the afternoon of September 20th, 1944, the thick fog that had shrouded the battlefield of Arracourt began to dissolve. The sky cleared to a brilliant, piercing blue. For the men of the 113th Panzer Brigade, this was the moment the trap snapped shut. Suddenly, the low rumble of diesel engines on the ground was drowned out by a terrifying, high-pitched drone coming from the heavens. It was a sound that every German soldier on the Western Front had learned to fear more than artillery, more than mines, and more than the enemy infantry. "Jabos!" a lookout screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Jabo was short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber, and the shape diving out of the sun was the most feared of them all, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. To the American pilots of the 19th Tactical Air Command, the lifting fog revealed a target rich beyond their wildest dreams. Below them, strung out along the muddy roads and exposed on the open hillsides, were dozens of German tanks and hundreds of support vehicles. They were clustered together, their movements stalled by the aggressive maneuvering of the American Shermans. The P-47s didn't just attack, they descended like birds of prey. These were massive, rugged planes, armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns that could saw a truck in half, and carrying 500-pound bombs or high-velocity rockets under their wings. The carnage began instantly. The lead flight of Thunderbolts rolled over and dove, the air filled with the roar of their 2,000 horsepower radial engines. The German tank commanders, buttoned up inside their steel monsters, felt the ground shake as the first bombs impacted. A 500-pound bomb doesn't need to hit a tank directly to disable it. The concussive blast alone was flipping 60-ton Tiger tanks onto their sides like toys. The shock waves turned the insides of the Panzers into bells, stunning the crews and shattering their optics. But the death from above was only half of the equation. This was the moment General Patton's doctrine of combined arms truly shone. On the ground, the American tank crews of the 4th Armored Division saw the Silver Wings diving and knew exactly what to do. They pressed the attack.
"Keep 'em pinned," Colonel Abrams ordered. "Don't let 'em move." The Shermans and Hellcats poured fire into the disorganized German columns. They used high explosive shells to strip away the German infantry, leaving the tanks blind and unsupported. When the German tanks tried to maneuver to face the American tanks, they exposed themselves to the sky. When they stopped to aim their anti-aircraft machine guns at the planes, they became sitting ducks for the American tanks. It was a tactical dilemma with no solution. Look up and you die by the tank. Look down and you die by the plane. The scene on the road to Juvilais became a killing field. The German retreat turned into a traffic jam of burning steel. The precision of the American artillery, guided by spotter planes that could now see everything, walked walls of fire back and forth across the German positions. The majestic Tiger tanks, the invincible weapons Hitler had stripped from the Russian front, were helpless. Their thick frontal armor was useless against a rocket slamming into their thin engine decks from a 60-degree angle. One German officer, later captured near the wreckage of his command vehicle, described the scene with a hollow stare. "It was not a battle," he said. "It was a demolition. We could not move, we could not hide, we could not fight. The sky was falling on us, and the earth was exploding beneath us." By late afternoon, the 113th Panzer Brigade had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The roads were clogged with the charred skeletons of panthers and tigers. The air was thick with the black, oily smoke of burning gasoline and rubber. The American pilots, low on fuel and ammunition, dipped their wings in a salute to the muddy tankers below before banking back toward their bases. The wall of steel that Hitler had sent to stop Patton had been dismantled piece by piece by a coordinated symphony of destruction. The hunters had become the hunted, and in the killing fields of Arracourt, the Wehrmacht learned that without the sky, no amount of armor on the ground could save them.
September 22, 1944. The fog had lifted, and the screaming of the P-47 Thunderbolts had faded into the distance. Silence returned to the rolling hills of Lorraine, but it was the heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard. For 3 days, the earth around Arracourt had trembled under the tracks of the largest concentration of German armor seen in France since the Normandy breakout. Hitler had sent his wall of steel, the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, to crush General Patton's Third Army. He had sent 92 of the feared Tiger and Panther tanks, machines designed to be invincible, monsters that were supposed to turn the tide of the war. Now, as the smoke drifted lazily across the wet fields, the truth was laid bare in burning iron. Captain James Leach of the 4th Armored Division climbed out of his Sherman tank. His face was caked in grime and cordite. He walked slowly through the tall grass, his boots crunching on debris. What he saw was not a formation of invincible warriors, but a junkyard. The fields were littered with the blackened skeletons of the master race's engineering. It was a scene of absolute devastation. Everywhere he looked, the long, menacing barrels of German 88mm and 75mm guns pointed aimlessly at the sky or drooped toward the mud. Here, a Panther tank lay on its side, flipped over like a dead beetle by a close-range, high-explosive impact. There, a massive Tiger II, the King Tiger, sat silent, its turret blown clean off by a lucky shot that had ignited its ammunition rack. Other tanks were intact but abandoned, their crews having fled in terror when they ran out of fuel or got stuck in the mud, leaving the mighty machines as useless steel statues. Technical intelligence teams moved among the wreckage with clipboards, counting the dead.
The numbers they tallied were staggering. They were almost impossible to believe. The 113th Panzer Brigade, the unit Hitler had created specifically to destroy Patton, had virtually ceased to exist. Out of the 42 Panthers and dozens of assault guns that had begun the attack, only a handful had escaped back into the fog. The rest were here, burning in the French countryside. The 111th Panzer Brigade fared no better. They had been fed into the meat grinder and chewed up by a combination of American tactical brilliance, air power, and artillery. The myth of the invincible Panzer was broken right there in the mud of Arracourt. For years, Allied soldiers had whispered about the Tiger tank with a sense of dread. It was the boogeyman. It was the machine that couldn't be killed. But Arracourt proved that a machine is only as good as the men inside it and the logistics behind it. The American commanders realized something crucial as they inspected the captured vehicles. The odometers on the brand-new Panthers showed less than 300 kilometers. These tanks hadn't been defeated by superior armor. They had been defeated by their own complexity and the incompetence of their rushed training. The German crews, terrified and inexperienced, had driven their superior tanks into tactical traps. They had been outmaneuvered by the inferior Shermans, whose veteran crews fought with the coordination of a symphony orchestra. General Patton arrived at the scene later, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the sun. He looked out over the graveyard of the Panzers. He saw the burning hulks of Hitler's last great gamble. The report that went back to Eisenhower's headquarters was cold and mathematical. The Americans lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The Germans lost or abandoned 107 armored vehicles. It was a massacre, a ratio of 4-1 in favor of the Americans. The Battle of Arracourt was the death knell of the Wehrmacht's offensive capability in 1944. Hitler had thrown his best machines at the Americans, and the Americans had broken them not with miracle weapons, but with speed, skill, and grit. As the Third Army's engines roared to life again, preparing to continue their march toward the German border, they left the burning graveyard behind them. The Tiger was no longer a monster to be feared. It was just another pile of scrap metal on the road to victory. The psychological hold of the Panzers was gone. The hunters had become the hunted, and the road to Germany was now open.